Hey, before we get started, I want to remind you that Truce is listener-supported. If you want to be a part of this one-of-a-kind show that asks big questions in an approachable way, become a patron. For just $5 a month, you can help me tell big stories like this upcoming season on the history of fundamentalism. And you'll get access to bonus materials. That's all at patreon.com/trucepodcast. That's patreon.com/trucepodcast.
This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. Visit whereyou'refrom.org for more information. That's whereyafrom.org.
This episode is part of a long series about how some evangelicals in the United States tied themselves to the Republican Party. It can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back and start at the beginning of Season 6. Also, I released a version of this episode in Season 3, but I've reworked it and re-recorded it to fit with this season. Even if you've heard it before, it contains some new material and may be of interest. Thomas Cranmer was burned alive. After watching two of his friends meet the same fate, he was executed for treason. Cranmer is an important figure you've probably never heard of. I mean, he died in 1556. This hasn't made news in a while, but his influence is felt even today. His was a tough time for the Christian church. Martin Luther had only recently nailed up his theses. The Protestant Reformation was in full swing. People were murdered for their beliefs. Cranmer was a reformer, meaning he was not on the side of the Catholic Church. When King Henry VIII of England wanted to divorce his wife, Thomas helped assemble the legal case that it could be done. Essentially, this act created the Church of England, a church that was sponsored and controlled by a government. Which, may not sound bad. The church gets financial support, maybe a little access to power, but if the state wants to, say, use the church to encourage you to back an evil king, one who keeps executing his wives, it gets sticky really fast. Like I said, this was a turbulent time to be in the Christian church, especially in England, where the kings and queens seesawed between Catholic and Protestant. Protestants rise to power and Catholics get dead. Catholics rise to power and Protestants, well, Depending on the beliefs of who was in charge, your religion was either favored or murdered, based on the whims of whoever was in charge. Cranmer lived in this seesaw world. Not only did he get the king the divorce that he wanted, which eventually earned him the title of Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer also wrote the Book of Common Prayer. Depending on your denomination, you may never have heard of the Book of Common Prayer, but it's just like what it sounds. Printed prayers used by the Church of England. It was written in those crazy, tumultuous times, so Cranmer tried to walk a tightrope. Protestant, but not super Protestant. Liturgical, but not totally Catholic. Reformers didn't like it, really didn't like it. The Book of Common Prayer is sometimes cited as one of the reasons that the Puritans despised the Church of England. They thought the book didn't go far enough to distance itself from Rome. It's not the only reason that they went to the New World, what would become the United States, but it is part of it. They also didn't like how cozy the church was with the state. After King Henry died, Edward VI became king, which was, no problem for Cranmer. Edward was on the side of Protestantism. Later, Mary Tudor became queen. Now, Mary Tudor was Catholic. The pendulum had swung the other way. She brought back Latin Mass, rituals, all sorts of stuff. And people who disagreed with her didn't fare so well, including Cranmer. They made him watch his friends burn alive. Under duress, he famously signed documents that put him under papal authority, recanting his writings that supported the Reformation. Yet, he renounced his renunciations before his death, angry at his own hand for having signed the documents. When his time came to be burned, he made sure that his hands were the first to meet the flames because they had betrayed him. Cranmer's story brings up a lot of questions for those of us who are Christians. How do we feel about the bonding of church and state? Because the Church of England was, well, it was the Church of England. Because the church was part of the government, it could be used to do the bidding of the government. And when the government switched leaders, when that seesaw tipped, everything got upended. Cranmer's story begs us to ask, what length will we go to get our theological way? And what will we do with those who disagree with us? Things look great when our people are in charge, but what happens when leadership moves in a different direction? When you go from setting the rules to not even having a prayer? You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starron, and this is Truce. By the mid-1900s, God was everywhere in American public life. The National Prayer Breakfast on the money, preached on television and radio, in advertisements all over the country. School children held their hands over their hearts every morning to say the Pledge of Allegiance, which had recently added the words "under God," making it, in the minds of some, a religious expression. Others called it a political expression that happened to mention God. Gideons handed out Bibles in many schools, and God was on our currency. Presidents were inaugurated with prayer. Witnesses called to testify in a court of law swore on a Bible that they would tell the truth, so help them God. A wave of public religious expressions swept the nation. Sometimes it seemed like everyone wanted to get on board, including the Board of Regents, the organization that oversees education in one particular state. They decided that because the United States had such a rich religious history, it should be reflected in a prayer every morning in their schools. Now, what state do you think it was? Which one wanted prayer in schools in 1951? Probably somewhere in the South? The Bible Belt? The Midwest? Kentucky? Georgia? No, this was New York, what many today would consider a pretty liberal part of the Union. In 1951, their Board of Regents, with a unanimous decision, decided to adopt school prayer. It would be part of their morning flag ceremonies. You know, like raising the stars and stripes and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Let me just point out, though, before we get too far, they didn't have it before 1951. So later, when it gets taken away in New York, resist the temptation to see it as something that always existed. It lasted in New York for just about a decade. So they added to this daily ceremony a few lines that became known as the Regent's Prayer.
Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country.
Here's the deal. It wasn't mandatory that the schools do this thing. It was a suggestion, along with a suggestion that schools read speeches by President Eisenhower and documents like the Declaration of Independence. It was up to the local school districts to figure out if and how they would implement it. And many did. In June 1955, the New York City superintendents suggested that classroom teachers should, quote,
identify God as the ultimate source of natural and moral law.
That went for math classes, science classes, even in shop, where teachers were encouraged to focus the kids on the handiwork of the Supreme Being that was reflected in the raw materials they worked with. And then, to make ashtrays out of it. You guessed what state encouraged schools to pray. Now, can you guess who opposed those prayers? Are you ready for another surprise? It was Protestant and Jewish leaders who spoke up. That's right, against prayer in schools. And of all people, the ACLU got involved, arguing that the statement of the Board of Regents, well, I'll let you hear it in their words, because I think it's important. They said that the superintendent's statement
substitutes for the belief in God a vague theism for which, it implies, we all subscribe. The fact is, we do not.
The complaint of the ACLU and many Protestants was, in part, that the prayer was vague. It was non-specific, which is not how most of us worship. Let's hear the Regent's Prayer one more time.
Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country.
Which God is it talking about? Doesn't say. To some, that may seem like a solid compromise, but the reality is that lots of us worship a specific deity. It's a criticism that some have lodged against things like God being added to the money and the Pledge of Allegiance. Which God are we talking about? That didn't deter some 300 New York school districts from continuing their prayers, which sounds like a lot, but it was only around 10% of the total districts in the state. Still, 300 ain't nothing. Votes to adopt or avoid school prayer soon divided people along religious lines, often separating Catholics who were for it and Jews who were not. The battle led to a lawsuit against a district in Long Island which had adopted the Regent's prayer. 3 of the 5 people against the district were Jewish, and there was worry that this would maybe create anti-Semitic hatred in the region. So when it came time to picking a lawyer for the case, the parents chose a Catholic one. The legal battle became known as Engle v. Vitale. The question in the case seems pretty clear. Is prescribed prayer in schools legal or illegal? And this was no easy decision, because the Establishment Clause of the United States Constitution says,
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Cut and dry, right? Congress can't set up a national religion. Remember, one of the main concerns that early settlers had on the continent was the power that the state had over the Church of England. When the king didn't like rules prohibiting divorce, he simply created his own church. Bada bing, bada boom. The government could control worship, even having one of its guys write the Book of Common Prayer. Let's hear the next phrase of the Constitution.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Oof. So if you stop people from praying, is that the government prohibiting the free exercise of religion? Or is a school-endorsed prayer really free exercise? Because kids are instructed by their teachers to do it, and there's social pressure to partake. Kids were allowed to be excused from the prayer. They didn't have to say it. But if everyone else is doing something, that can be pretty intimidating in school. Now think about it. Your morning starts, they raise the American flag, and if you were cool with the pledge, you stayed for that.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
And then because the prayer is next, you have to leave for 15 seconds or maybe 30 by the time the kids get settled. Then you come back in with everyone watching you, like really standing out. Is setting aside time to say a specific prayer in a school constitutional? Are students being treated equally if some of them have to stand outside for a few minutes every day? So a group of parents took the case to court. In August of 1959, the county judge decided in favor of the school board, saying the Regent's prayer did not violate the Establishment Clause, and it certainly didn't violate the free exercise of religion. The judge said that public prayer was part of the national heritage. After all, New York State judicial system at the time urged its members to display the new national motto, "In God We Trust." How could acknowledging God in our national motto really be all that different from acknowledging Him in prayer? The parents struck out on their first attempt, so they tried again in the appellate court. And that didn't work. They took it to the Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, which in 1961 upheld the rulings of the lower courts. The Chief Justice argued in his own words,
Not only is this prayer not a violation of the First Amendment, but holding that it is such a violation would be in defiance of all of American history.
Strike 3. The majority decision pointed to how God was prevalent in American life. The Declaration of Independence mentions Him. It does.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
God was on the money, which for paper currency had been there all of about 4 years. New daily prayers were held in Congress thanks to Abraham Vereide. Then there was the National Day of Prayer and God being in the Pledge of Allegiance, all of which were added in around the last decade. Plus, there were prayers given at the Continental Congress when the country was founded. Some argued that religious expression was in our heritage, even though most of their examples were pretty recent. The only place for the case to go was the Supreme Court, the highest in the country. When we return, we'll cover how the Supreme Court referenced the Book of Common Prayer to strike down the Regent's Prayer. Stay with us. This episode is brought to you by No Small Endeavor, the acclaimed podcast from Great Feeling Studios and PRX. In each episode, host and award-winning theologian Lee C. Schempp sits down with courageous and impassioned people, like Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and civil rights hero Reverend James Lawson, talking about what it means to find true happiness and flourish in day-to-day life. And if you're looking for somewhere to start, why not check out the recent episode with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Tim Alberta on Christian nationalism's role in the Republican Party. Follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. When we left off, New York State suggested that schools offer a prayer, a pretty bland and generic one. About 10% of districts ran with it, only to have parents bring a lawsuit, which failed in 3 different trials until finally reaching the Supreme Court of the United States. The case essentially hinged on this question: was this prayer an act of patriotism or an act of worship? If it was patriotism, then it had a lot in common with the Pledge of Allegiance. Fundamentally, what is the Pledge of Allegiance? Is it patriotic, or is it a statement of faith? Those of you who listened to Season 3 may remember that its history is rooted in patriotism, a nationalistic desire. The part about God was only added during the 1950s. It is, essentially, a patriotic statement with a mention of God. Now, what about the Regent's Prayer? Listen again.
Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country.
The formula is flipped. Instead of a patriotic statement with a mention of God, the prayer is a statement of faith with a mention of the country. In part, that is why the Supreme Court struck down the decision of the lower courts, because the prayer is clearly a government-sponsored endorsement of religion, and not the expression of patriotism that the New York Board of Regents said it was. Justice Hugo Black asked for the privilege of writing the majority opinion. Black is an interesting character. Himself theologically liberal, he's said to have told his son, speaking of the Christian faith,
"I cannot believe, but I can't not believe either."
He was an agnostic, but his opinion really made me think. It's quite eloquent and reads like a spiritual pilgrimage, laying out the historic basis for his argument. Here is a piece of it. And in this, he's referring to the Book of Common Prayer.
It is a matter of history that this very practice of establishing governmentally composed prayers for religious services was one of the reasons which caused many of our early colonists to leave England and seek religious freedom in America. The Book of Common Prayer, which was created under governmental direction and which was approved by Acts of Parliament in 1548 and 1549, set out in minute detail the accepted form and content of prayer and other religious ceremonies to be used in the established tax-supported Church of England. The controversies over the book and what should be its contents repeatedly threatened to disrupt the peace of that country as the accepted forms of prayer in the established church changed with the views of the particular ruler that happened to be in control at the time. Other groups, lacking the necessary political power to influence the government on the matter, decided to leave England and its established church and seek freedom in America from England's governmentally ordained and supported religion.
Essentially, he argued that one of the reasons English settlers came to this country was to escape publicly mandated religion. He also goes on to note, ironically, that some of those colonists set up the same kind of system they resented once they got here. The Pilgrims, in other words, became what they themselves disliked about England, establishing state-funded churches that were involved in their daily lives and dictated worship. Justice Black was also concerned about what it meant for this country if this kind of thing was encouraged. Remember that seesawing from the beginning of the show? When one king or queen died, the next was free to change the religion, throwing the entire country into chaos with every new administration. Justice Black argued that the Founding Fathers included the Establishment Clause specifically to keep that from happening in the United States.
The First Amendment was added to the Constitution to stand as a guarantee that neither the power nor the prestige of the federal government would be used to control, support, or influence the kinds of prayer the American people can say. that the people's religions must not be subjected to the pressures of government for change each time a new political administration is elected to office.
We don't often consider that in discussions of church and state, the destabilizing effect it would have on the country if we change religions or denominational preference with each successive administration. Maybe that seems kind of a weird thing to be frightened of, but the decision was handed down during the Kennedy administration. John F. Kennedy was the nation's first Catholic president. His opponents worried that he'd take orders from the Pope, that his religion would fundamentally change the United States. Again, that would not be unheard of in the history of the world. That's exactly what happened in England in the 1500s. It's the reason Thomas Cranmer was burned at the stake. If Kennedy's opponents had seen their nightmare become a reality, things would have been bleak indeed. Of course, none of that stuff happened, but looking back through the lens of history, we know the difference it makes when the church is tied to the state. If you don't have enough evidence, research the Spanish Inquisition. As you can imagine, the case caused a stir in the media. Headlines read, "God banned from the state." People were in an uproar, including Billy Graham. Newswire sent out almost exclusively negative comments from members of Congress, ignoring those who sided with the decision. Sensationalism got the best of them, as it does with all of us from time to time. People worried that religion was being outlawed in the country. The thing is, it wasn't. The court had actually done a lot to make that distinction. The Regent's prayer was illegal because it had been written and implemented by a government body. They didn't outlaw prayer or prayer in schools, just prayer written and expressed by the government. And that's a big difference. Justice Hugo Black received over 1,000 letters in opposition. Some of them are downright nasty. But he responded the same way President Truman responded years earlier when he was asked to institute a National Day of Prayer. They both quoted Matthew 6, which tells Christians to pray in their rooms with their doors closed, rather than in public, where their acts of piety can be seen. I mean, yes, Jesus prayed in public, and the disciples prayed in public. It's not so much about the place as it is the reason and the heart behind the prayer. Here is Matthew 6:1.
Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven.
Then in 1963, the Supreme Court heard another case, Abington School District v. Schempp. In this one, Edward Louis Schempp, his wife Sydney, and 2 of their children brought a case against their Pennsylvania school district. State law held that
at least 10 verses from the Holy Bible shall be read without comment at the opening of each public school on each school day. Any child shall be excused from such Bible reading or attending such Bible reading upon the written request of his parent or guardian.
It was part of the morning announcements. The verses were chosen by students and then left without question or comment. The Schempp family argued that this practice violated both the First and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Reading the majority opinion again, it came down to the First Amendment, writing,
"In the relationship between man and religion, the state is firmly committed to a position of neutrality,"
stating clearly that the role of the government was not to create a secular society either. They could neither establish a religion nor prohibit their free practice. And in just about 1 year, mandatory school prayer and Bible reading were struck down in the United States for similar reasons, which came as a shock to some. And the ripple effects are something we'll cover this season as parents put their kids in private schools or educated them at home. Interestingly, though, according to U.S. Census data, despite my assumptions, this did not lead to a massive upswing in private school enrollment. Let me reiterate that not all schools were even doing prayers and Bible readings to begin with. We saw this demonstrated in New York State, where only 10% adopted the Regent's prayer. Second, as discussed earlier, if we as a country honor one religion over another, then the beliefs of our leaders can cause us to swing back and forth over time. And as the religious ideals of our country change, would our religious expression have to evolve as well? Take JFK as an example. If he and other leaders in the government were Catholic, would the United States have to be changed to reflect the leadership? Or if Mitt Romney had won a few years ago, would we have to be reading the Book of Mormon in classrooms? Maybe less dramatic, if we decided to keep this all sort of Protestant Christian, what denomination would we choose that satisfied the most people? If Pentecostalism becomes the most popular theological strain, does that mean that our expressions should be Pentecostal? How about fundamentalist? Even if we were to declare this a Christian nation and that all expressions of government-sponsored religion were to be expressly Christian, we'd have a hard time delineating what that means. I mean, for fun, take out a sheet of paper and come up with your own prescribed prayer, like the Regent's prayer. One that could be read in front of every school. Try to write one that will satisfy every major Bible-believing Christian. Really, do it. It's surprisingly difficult. Even the Lord's Prayer is unlikely to satisfy. For one thing, it never mentions Jesus. Charismatics might be upset that it doesn't talk about the Holy Spirit. Catholics that it leaves out Mary and the saints, not to mention that they don't say, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever," when they say it. There's no discussion of how to become a believer, of salvation, or hell. Truly, I would love to hear your suggestions of the perfect prescribed prayer that would be accessible to all Christians. Email them to me at trucepodcast@yahoo.com or tag the show on social media and let me know what you come up with. Believe me, it's harder than you think. Is religious expression in schools a good thing, a bad thing, or something in between? We can celebrate the fact that our country is not subject to the theological whims of our leaders. Prayer and Bible reading, I think, are generally a good idea. But they can also be used as a weapon we can force on people of different faiths, or a chance for us to grandstand in public to score points. They can bring us closer to God, and we can use them to push others further away. You know, the funny thing about weapons, we love them when we're the ones holding them. But when they're aimed at us, when we stand next to the fire ourselves, the story changes pretty quickly. And if you don't believe me, just ask Thomas Cranmer. This episode was inspired by the book In God We Trust by Kevin Cruz. The Evangelicals by Francis Fitzgerald was also a great benefit. The full text of Justice Black's opinion is really interesting to read. I'll put links to it in your show notes and on the website. Also, Truce is listener supported. If you become a monthly patron of the show, you'll gain access to my reading of Justice Black's opinion from the archives. You can learn more at trucepodcast.com/donate. I'm working really hard to do this show full time. Your gift of any size will help get me closer to the goal. You can find Truce on social media at Truce Podcast. Special thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode. Eric Nevins of the Halfway There podcast, my friend Jackie Hart, Jenna Erlinson of the Bridge of the Faithful podcast, my friend Chris Sloan, and Shay and Michelle Watkins of the Pantry podcast. God willing, I'll be back in 2 weeks with more. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.